Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
After months of uncertainty, the Department of Labor is resuming enforcement of affirmative action requirements for federal contractors who hire veterans and people with disabilities. While broader affirmative action rules tied to race and gender were rescinded earlier this year, these programs remain in place by law, and they're now being revised to reflect the administration's policy priorities. Here to break down what contractors need to know, what's being proposed, and why this moment matters for compliance and equity alike is partner at Haynes Boone, Dan Ramish. Dan, it's great to see you again.
Great to see you too, Terry.
Well, we're going to talk about the Office of Federal Contractor Compliance Programs in DOL. That's been a topic on the president's agenda since he came in, and there's been some puts and takes in the organization itself and some confusion about mission, but you've got some clarity for us today. So let me turn it over to you for some background.
Absolutely, Terry. So back in January, after the president took office, he rescinded the longstanding general applicability affirmative action requirements that apply to government contractors. Those were under a Johnson-era Executive Order 11246. And that was one of the actions in his first week in office. Of course, this has been one of the policy focuses of the administration. But there were outstanding questions when that happened about other affirmative action requirements that are statutory. And those are affirmative action requirements under the Vietnam-era Veterans Readjustment Assistance Act, or VEVRA, and Section 503 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or Section 503. And those affirmative action requirements apply specifically to classes of protected veterans and people with disabilities. And because those were statutory, the administration didn't have the same latitude to make changes, but also those affirmative action programs were kind of enmeshed with the broader Executive Order 11246 programs. And so shortly after the president took office, they issued an order, Department of Labor, holding in abeyance enforcement activities under Section 503 and VEVRA. And the question was, what was the future of those programs and how we didn't know how long it would be on pause. And we now have several actions by the administration that give at least some additional information about how they'll move forward with those programs.
So before we get into the particulars of the new information, could you just refresh us on what VEVRA and 503 requirements are?
Sure. So in brief, VEVRA and Section 503 include non-discrimination requirements, and that's both the statutes, and then Department of Labor has implementing regulations. And those implementing regulations are mirrored in the FAR and kind of refer back to the Department of Labor, which incidentally is one of the things that the FAR Council will be looking at, the relationship between the FAR and DOL regulations. But so in the first place, implementing regulations require non-discrimination throughout the employment process, from recruiting to hiring to compensation. There's a long list of different areas where contractors need to ensure that they're not discriminating against these classes. Then there are notice requirements, both for job applicants and for employees, notifying labor unions, including legends in employment solicitations and advertisements. There are flow-down requirements, so this isn't just a prime contract requirement where subcontractors, meet the thresholds. Then they need to be subject to these requirements as well and comply with them, and the prime needs to make sure it goes down the chain. And then the most significant obligation for contractors, and this has an employee threshold, but the most significant obligation is affirmative action program. And so contractors with 50 or more employees that also meet dollar thresholds are required to take affirmative steps to employ and advance in employment in the case of VEVRA, protected veterans, and in the case of Section 503, persons with disabilities. And there are detailed requirements in the regulations about what that entails.
Thanks for that reminder. So now let's go back to the Secretary of Labor has issued a new rule lifting that abeyance. So I guess the old rules are back in place, but help us understand exactly what the current situation is.
Yeah, so some important points in that. So this was the July 2nd Secretary's Order 08-2025, and it did lift the previous order abeyance of Section 503 and VEVRA. So it addressed a number of different elements of the enforcement activities around those programs. So first, complaints. In many cases, actions by OFCCP would be triggered by an employee complaint or an applicant complaint. And the Department of Labor indicated that any pending complaints would now move forward and new complaints would be processed normally now that the abeyance is lifted. On the other hand, there were pending audits for 2025, which are normally announced in the fall of the previous year. There was a scheduling order back in November, and those compliance reviews, the administration said they're going to exercise their discretion to take no further action on those compliance reviews. So they're administratively closing them. So companies that were selected for audit last year and were scheduled for an audit this year, that won't move forward as originally planned. Then one other element that they specifically address is affirmative action program certifications, which is a more recent requirement that developed a few years back, where there's a portal for the Department of Labor where contractors have been required to certify their affirmative action programs. And it sounds like DOL is still sorting out how that's going to work as they disentangle the Executive Order 11246 piece. And so there isn't a certification window this year. So that will kind of remain on hold. But DOL emphasized that, of course, the Section 503 and VEVRA obligations, which are part of the statute and regulation and contract obligations for government contractors, remain in place, and contractors need to follow them.
I'm speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. So speaking of contractors, which contractors do need to follow these rules?
So these requirements are broadly applicable to government contractors. So Section 503 applies to all companies with a government prime contract or subcontract over $15,000, unless the work is being performed outside of the United States by employees that were recruited outside the United States, or unless another exemption applies. And then VEVRA generally applies to companies with government prime or subcontracts valued over $150,000 with the same exceptions. And then there is the higher employee standard that separately applies specifically for the affirmative action program requirements.
So now there's some proposed rules that may change these requirements. What are you hearing about that?
So around the same time of the order, early July, the Department of Labor issued proposed rules for both VEVRA and Section 503 implementing regulations within the DOL regulations. And the VEVRA changes are largely administrative, kind of moving things around and removing cross-references to the now rescinded Executive Order 11246 and making corresponding relocation of coverage of administrative enforcement proceeding procedures. But there are some substantive changes on the Section 503 regulatory side. Two notable ones. One of them is the proposed rule would rescind the requirements that contractors invite job applicants and employees to self-identify disability status. And then the second change is they're proposing to rescind utilization analysis and utilization goal requirements. So I guess to offer a little bit of context of those requirements, Section 503 contemplates that government contractors will invite job applicants and employees to identify disability status for purposes of taking affirmative action to encourage and promote employment of people with disabilities. And then the utilization analysis, there's a regulatory utilization goal of 7%, and there's also a utilization analysis that's required where contractors are supposed to look at how their program is working and what the actual utilization of people with disabilities is. And if they're not satisfying the 7% utilization goal, they're supposed to review their program and processes to see if there are impediments to equally employing people with disabilities. And the administration, they acknowledge that the regulations specifically say that the utilization goals aren't quotas, because quotas are not permitted under anti-discrimination law, but they said that the structure with the utilization goals, they were concerned that this could lead contractors to have quotas in order to meet the goals. And they said the regulations went beyond what the statute required, that the utilization assessment was not statutory, that it was just a regulatory mechanism. So that's kind of part of the basis. The other thing is they mentioned that the Americans with Disabilities Act actually precludes employers from asking job applicants about disability status or the related questions, and has restrictions on asking employees about disability status. And so there were some concerns about inconsistency with that statute. So those were kind of the administration's explanation for making those changes.
And those rules were open for comment until when?
So comments are due for both proposed rules September 2nd, 2025, so the standard 60-day public comment period.
Great. And so, Dan, what do you want to make sure that contractors know as takeaways from this discussion?
It's important for government contractors to know that enforcement is back in full effect for VEVRA and Section 503 requirements. Of course, the requirements didn't go away, but they are now fully back in effect, subject to, of course, the certification still being on hold for affirmative action programs. and the audits will presumably proceed in the next audit season. So unlike the general applicability affirmative action requirements, of course, government contractors in the first place need to be aware that the Section 503 and VEVRA requirements for people with disabilities and veterans are still in place and aren't going anywhere. And they remain a contractual, regulatory, statutory requirement. And contractors and subcontractors should make sure that they're meeting those requirements. And this is probably a good time to review programs, partly because of these proposed rules and the change in direction, and partly because of changes in the administration's policies.
Dan, thanks so much for bringing us up to speed on this important development.
Absolutely, Terry. Thanks.
I've been speaking with Dan Ramish. He's a partner at Haynes Boone. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.
What makes a great leader in government? Christine Harada joins WEPA CEO Shane Canfield to reflect on her journey from aerospace engineering to the White House. In this episode, she shares lessons on public-private collaboration, leading with purpose, and why service, not power, should guide leadership.
Hello, and welcome to the Lessons in Leadership podcast. I'm your host, Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Today, I'm joined by Christine Harada, former Senior Advisor at the Office of Federal Procurement Policy within the Office of Management and Budget. Ms. Harada, welcome, and thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
You spent portions of your career working in both the public and the private sector. And from your experience, what makes leadership in the federal sector different than the private sector?
At the highest level, leadership in the public sector is very fundamentally at its core mission-driven. Right? The work is in the service of the public good, and the goals and the programs are frequently long-term, they're systemic, and they're incredibly complex. And success, isn't necessarily measured by quarterly earnings. We don't have that kind of drumbeat, but certainly more by the lasting impact that we have on Americans' lives. What's also unique about public sector is, in my view, the profound sense of history that you feel. And I think certainly I was very aware about the work that I was doing and how it builds on the efforts of those who came before me, and that future generations of leaders also depend on the decisions that were being made today. And that, for me, certainly provided a greater weight of responsibility.
That's a wonderful answer. And I was in the private sector for much of my career, and now WEPA is a nonprofit, and I really relate to what you said about being mission-driven rather than profit-driven. You've got a long-term view, and always at the core of it is serving others.
Yes.
Is there a moment that stands out to you from early in your career that influenced your leadership style later on?
I started out my career as an aerospace engineer, building satellites and airplanes. And when I first entered the workforce, my organization at the time had 120 people. We were a large company, 120 people, 4 women, and I was the only woman of color. I was also the youngest throughout the entire organization. And so, I remember having an experience when I was doing some engineering work. We had a design review, and I had seen some issues with the flight software that I pointed out. At the time, they're like, maybe it's not really that big of a concern. I was like, but in my heart, I knew that the issue was real and stayed with it. And sure enough, a few weeks later, that topic came up again, and we addressed it. Turns out my concern did indeed prove to be valid. And so it's just one of those experiences that really sank into me around ensuring that I am listening to everybody, period, end of story, within the organization, really thinking through about how do we take into consideration opinions from all different spectra. As a third-generation Japanese American, right, I was raised to be humble, keep your head down and work hard, et cetera. But at times, leadership also requires you to speak up, do so politely, with courage, et cetera, even though you may be the only voice in your room, but certainly trust your voice. It also really helped shape my belief around diversity. DEI programs right now are viewed in a negative light. We're all mosaics, and they become better because you have those different experiences. And that's really stayed with me throughout the entirety of my career.
The diversity issue is a really big one. Coming from the insurance industry, that's an industry which is working on that. It's really a diversity of viewpoint and perspective and experiences that does influence your business, and more diverse employee bases absolutely helps. Was there a time in your federal career perhaps when you were at OMB, that you faced what you consider a real challenge. And how did you overcome it?
One moment that really stands out in particular was when I was serving as the Federal Chief Sustainability Officer during the Obama administration. We had set, like many administrations, had set some really ambitious goals, very, very, very ambitious goals around how do we think about making the federal government's operations much more sustainable. But the challenge wasn't so much about the scale or the technical capacity of the organization. A lot of it was really centered around the funding. We overcame this largely by being very strategic, helping out with blocking and tackling with the variety of legal issues or legal questions that might have come up, like how do we address this? Certainly in the federal government, you're more often leading through influence as opposed to pure form authority, and that you really need to listen deeply, communicate clearly with folks, building out those coalitions and engaging with your stakeholders. And I know many folks in government speak like that, but that is the truth.
As someone who's spent time in both the federal and the private sectors, what makes the relationship between the two sectors important?
Certainly, it's an absolutely essential partnership, and I would add on to that like nonprofits or philanthropic organizations. As I mentioned before, I'm Japanese American, and in Japan there's a symbol for thunder, which looks like 3 arrows pointing around each other in a circular pattern, kind of to represent the swirl, if you will, of clouds. And that's kind of how I view the relationship between the government, the private sector, and the nonprofit sector. The government frequently sets the vision, the policy, the direction, but of course it's the private sector that brings the capital, the innovation, the skill set, the capabilities, et cetera, to be able to execute. Partnering with that, of course, are the nonprofits who may be supporting the surrounding society. Public-private collaboration is not just about contracts or compliance, but it's also about figuring out what's your shared purpose. That's when real transformation can and does actually happen.
In life insurance, there's a concept, lifetime value, where bringing a new insured in costs a lot more money than the amount of premium. And so when you talk to commercial carriers, it's a similar kind of thing. You need to bring them into the concept that they're going to be with us 20 years, and after 5 years, you can ride through that. But it's a concept that isn't easy for commercial businesses to understand. That's a partnership too. Very, very similar. What advice would you give to somebody aspiring to become a leader in government?
There are 3 things, right? So firstly, around leadership in government, you want to make sure that you're leading with purpose. You want to stay grounded in your values, and don't underestimate the power of relationships. Remember why you entered public service in the first place, and that'll help carry you through some of the inevitable challenges that you're going to face. Making sure that you are also investing in relationships. In government, you rarely have full control, and I think this is, in my view, more important in government than perhaps in the private sector. You are frequently leading through influence. You are collaborating with very different parties who frequently have very different agendas than you do. And so building that trust, investing in building that trust and planting those seeds earlier and along the way in your career, I think is absolutely critical. And certainly last but not least, I would say, don't feel that you have to have it all figured out on day one. Absolutely stay open to the unexpected. Say yes to the opportunities that stretch you, and know that you can lead from wherever you are. It's not just about position or hierarchy. It's about the impact that you can have.
What wonderful advice, especially in today's world, which is a little topsy-turvy. Who is one person, someone you know personally, or perhaps someone well-known, that's impacted your leadership style?
The leaders that particularly stand out for me are Colin Powell, a woman named Carla Harris, who was a managing director in investment banking, and then last but not least would be my father. Starting with perhaps the more famous one, Colin Powell. I read his biography, loved his perspectives and the rules of leadership that have been particularly influential for me, right? So get mad, then get over it, share the credit, perpetual optimism, a force multiplier, things of that nature. And hearing his story was certainly very inspirational for me. And so I certainly very much look up to him and as a role model. The second person that I mentioned is a woman named Carla Harris. She's an African-American woman, became a managing director at an investment bank in the 80s, at a time when there were not that many women of color in investment banking in New York. And so she's published a book called Her Pearls of Wisdom. It's one of her trademarks. She always wore a pearl necklace, and she has Pearls of Wisdom around how can you be authentic and build relationships to be successful in super challenging environments. And she had a lot of guidance on the importance of finding sponsors and mentors. And certainly last but not least, my father is really my why for I do a lot of the work that I do in the public sector. He started out life like many other, immigrant kids in poverty. He was a strawberry farm laborer. Japanese Americans at the time were not allowed to own the land, so we worked the land. He grew up in that kind of environment. And I just think it's absolutely neat that someone who came really he was dirt poor, to say it, and his daughter ended up working in the White House twice. It's quite the American dream, and I would very much like to have that opportunity available for other people as well.
Well, wonderful, absolutely wonderful. Christine, thank you very much for your time today and all of these learnings. It's really good, impactful. Thank you for sharing.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
I'm Shane Canfield, CEO of WEPA. Until next time on Lessons in Leadership.
Find the full podcast and future episodes of Lessons in Leadership on the Federal News Network app and anywhere you enjoy your podcasts.